I first met Rosie in college. She was a bit on the sturdy side, wore large glasses and struggled with skin issues. She was an art major, and her fashion choices were anything but mainstream. Her style was bold and unconventional. Unfortunately, most of the guys, myself included, didn't exactly find her eccentric look all that attractive. Despite being in different fields, she was in art and I was in production technology. We ended up in the same computer graphics design class because of overlapping course requirements. She needed it to graduate and I needed it for AutoCAD. When we were assigned to work together on a group project, it was surprising how little we had spoken before, even though we were in the same classes. It became obvious pretty quickly that we were from totally different worlds. I was into sports, hanging out with the popular crowd, while Rosie smoked and hung out with the bohemian artistic types, the kind of people you'd expect to find at an indie film screening or an art gallery opening. Was dating cheerleaders and jocks, and she was often the overlooked friend or the backup girlfriend in her art circles. As we worked together, we spent more time than usual around each other. Naturally, I couldn't help but notice her more and more, and I could tell she noticed too. One evening, our conversation veered away from the project and into more personal territory. When my girlfriend came to pick me up, I couldn't shake the odd sense of sadness as I left Rosie behind, and it seemed like she felt it too. The next day, she was cold and distant. "What did I do?" I asked, genuinely confused. "You're an absolute idiot," she snapped, her voice trembling with emotion. Realizing this wasn't something we could work through in the middle of a crowded classroom, I took her hand and led her to a quiet bench in the park. After grabbing a couple of drinks, we sat down to continue our conversation. "Why do you think I'm such a jerk?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. "Because you are," she said, her voice quivering with emotion as tears welled up in her eyes. "I thought you were different, even though you're not artistic," she added, looking away. Her words stuck with me as we talked, and then she suddenly blurted out, "And then you with that girl. Are you mad because I went on a date?" I asked, taken aback. "No," she shot back. "It's just, you guys are all the same. You don't care about a real connection. You just want some shallow relationship with a pretty, brainless girl," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "Well," I replied, keeping my calm, "girls with looks know how to use them, whether it's in dating or in other situations." She shot me a skeptical glance and asked, "What do you mean by that?" I was starting to get irritated, but I answered, "They know how to show they're interested. They don't hold back." She was silent, her fists clenched, clearly angry. Deciding it was time to make my point clearer, I gently removed her big glasses, those glasses that hid her beauty, and kissed her. It was a deep, passionate kiss, one that seemed to melt all the tension between us. Later, I found out it was the first time she had ever kissed someone outside her family. That kiss sparked something deeper, and we kissed again more closely on that park bench. The next few weeks seemed to pass in a blur. We finished our project and got an A, but what mattered more was that we began dating. Rosie switched to wearing contact lenses, saw a dermatologist, and started dressing a little more traditionally. I never pressured her to change her bohemian style, but as we spent more time together, she needed some new clothes because, let's face it, women always need new clothes, right? She dragged me shopping and wanted my opinion. I told her jeans were a good choice, even for artists. She felt she was too big for jeans, but I reassured her, comparing her body to the full-figured models in Rubens' paintings. She bought the jeans, and honestly, she looked great in them. But I thought the tops and sweatshirts she wore didn't really fit with the new look. Our relationship with Rosie seemed magical, like something out of a fairy tale. It wasn't crazy or wild, but it was something special, ours. As her first lover, I wanted to make sure it was something memorable for her, something she would enjoy. Over time, Rosie became more interested in intimacy and even began asking for it more often. While we didn't explore anything extreme, every moment felt meaningful because I loved her deeply. A few weeks later, she looked at herself in the mirror and told me she felt like a bigger version of the women she used to despise. I assured her that no matter what, she was my girlfriend, and that was all that mattered. We were incredibly happy, and eventually we got engaged. After graduation, I landed a job at an automotive design firm, while Rosie found work at an art magazine. My family adored her and welcomed her with open arms. But her family, well, it was just her mom and her sister, and frankly, I didn't care much for them. At our engagement party, I overheard her sister muttering that I was too conventional and might stifle Rosie's artistic soul. Despite how radiant and happy Rosie looked, I heard her mom whisper to her sister, insinuating that we were only getting married because Rosie was pregnant and that the marriage wouldn't last. But we proved them wrong. We were genuinely happy and deeply in love. Then came our 7th anniversary. That's when her mom, Phoebe, started dropping hints about wanting grandchildren. After all, Rosie and I were her only hope, since her sister couldn't have kids. Rosie quickly assured her that we were trying. But despite our efforts over the years, we weren't having any luck. Phoebe, not one to let things go, booked us an appointment at a fertility clinic, assuming the issue was with me. I went through all the tests, provided the samples, and learned that I was perfectly fine. Phoebe, upon hearing the news, joked that we should practice more to help her become a grandmother before she got too old. But Rosie's test results were a shock to both of us. We discovered she had multiple reproductive health issues, making natural conception not just difficult but nearly impossible. That evening, I held her tight as she cried herself to sleep. I reassured her that adoption or other treatments were still options, but deep down, I was angry at her mother for pushing us so far. Through her tears, Rosie whispered, "If you want a divorce, you can have it, but I'll never leave you unless you push me away." I told her about her mother's insinuation that she might cheat on me to get pregnant. "I'll never betray you, Rosie. You mean everything to me," I promised. She looked at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty, and asked, "Why stay with a woman who can't have children?" I made sure she understood how serious I was when I answered, "Because I love you more than anything, and I couldn't live without you." She seemed to calm down a little and eventually fell asleep, but if I'm being honest, those days are now just a blur, and I can barely remember all the details. 2 days later, we got a call from the clinic about another appointment. During that consultation, the doctor dropped the bombshell. He had referred Rosie's tests to a specialist. What we learned next shocked us both to our core. Rosie had an aggressive form of early-stage cancer. Suddenly, everything made sense: the fatigue, the soreness, the mood swings. But at least we had caught it early, and the prognosis was favorable. The doctor immediately referred us to a specialized oncology center and scheduled an appointment for the next day. From there, Rosie underwent a series of tests, and I took a leave of absence from work to stay by her side, offering my support as best I could. In the weeks that followed, she had lymph node surgery and began radiation therapy. I stayed in the family suite at the cancer center to be as close to Rosie as possible. Every morning, I'd greet her, spend the day by her side, and even got special permission to stay overnight until she fell asleep. Her mother and sister visited now and then, but they mostly gave me the cold shoulder, maybe because they somehow thought I was to blame for Rosie's illness. Despite the treatments, the radiation therapy didn't work as expected. In fact, it ended up damaging healthy tissue along with the tumors, so we switched to chemotherapy. The radiation had already caused Rosie to lose a lot of weight, and the chemotherapy threatened to take her hair, too. The nurses at the hospital were incredibly supportive, going above and beyond to help me care for Rosie. One nurse, Carol, stood out in particular. She had striking red hair, bright green eyes, and a tall, slender figure. Her presence was a mix of warmth and kindness. She was always greeting me with a smile or a lighthearted joke, offering a hug or a listening ear when I needed it most, helping me keep a positive attitude during a time when it felt like everything was falling apart. Most of the nurses in the oncology unit worked long shifts, 4 10-hour days with 3 days off, but Carol had the night shift, working from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. She was there when I left Rosie at night and when I came back the next morning. She was unfailingly cheerful, especially around me. The only time I saw her anything less than upbeat was when she had a heated exchange with Rosie's mother, Phoebe. Phoebe had said something about how I might leave Rosie now that she was sick, and Carol reacted with a fierce protective streak, even threatening to step in if things got physical. "This environment is just so disheartening," Carol had said, clearly disgusted. Many of our patients barely get any visitors because their families are afraid of catching something, she explained. But you've been here every single day. You're with her when it's rough. She turned to Phoebe. Were you here when she needed help going to the restroom? Carol asked, voice sharp. Were you around when she lost her hair? He shaved his head to match hers, Carol said with a laugh, referring to my shiny scalp. Were you there for that? She pressed. He gives her sponge baths, helping her maintain her dignity, she continued, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Were you there for that? She shot at Phoebe. He's already used up all his vacation and sick leave to stay by her side, Carol said. Her insurance won't cover the treatment, so he's racked up massive debt for your daughter. And through all of it, he's been here every single day, holding her hand and assuring her that he loves her. She ended with a sharp jab, pointing her finger right in Phoebe's face. I wish I could have seen it for myself, but hearing about it afterward brought a small smile to my face. What really mattered, though, was that Rosie's well-being was at the forefront. Several nurses told me about the exchange, and they were all just as furious as Carol was. After that, I noticed that Phoebe seemed to soften towards me a little. In fact, she even came up to me one afternoon while I was holding Rosie's hand as she napped and patted me on the shoulder. Chemotherapy left Rosie physically weak, but it did work. She was cancer-free. Her hair started growing back, and we switched to a new diet to help her regain strength. She went through several surgeries to remove the excess skin from the weight she had lost, and Rosie emerged as a completely transformed woman. She had shed 80 pounds, her skin was clear, and her glasses were gone. She now wore contact lenses. Even her hair was restored. People who had known her before couldn't help but do a double take. While she wasn't as striking as Carol, she was undoubtedly the best version of herself, and my love for her hadn't wavered. I went back to work, putting in extra hours to cover the mounting medical expenses we'd racked up. Rosie couldn't work for a while, but our intimacy remained fulfilling, even grew stronger, as she often expressed how grateful she was for my support through her illness. However, something shifted. Rosie started casually dating women from her old job while I was away. It seemed like she was finding a new way to connect with people, something she hadn't done much before. Maybe it was her way of asserting her independence after everything we had been through, or perhaps a post-cancer affirmation. At the time, I didn't think much of it. What I didn't realize was that our marriage was beginning to fall apart. In the weeks that followed, Rosie started coming home later and later, often appearing tipsy. I've never had so much fun, she'd announce, her voice light with a sort of carefree enthusiasm. I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt every time I worked long hours, 12 to 16-hour days, to cover our medical debts while she was out enjoying herself without me. Her clothing became more revealing, and when I asked her about it, she said it was just about showing off her new body, that it was just for fun. I started to wonder when it became so important for her to seek validation from other people. Something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Despite my concerns, I hesitated to face the truth. I had poured everything into our relationship, especially after all we'd been through with her cancer. She had become my world. Meanwhile, my dedication at work didn't go unnoticed. I got a raise, a promotion, and a nice bonus. I saw this as an opportunity to plan a surprise vacation for Rosie, hoping it might help us reconnect. I didn't tell her right away, though. I decided to throw her a small birthday celebration first and discuss the idea of relocating together, thinking that it might help reignite our relationship. But things didn't go as planned, and what should have been a moment of joy ended up shattering my heart and our marriage. During a routine checkup, Rosie ran into Carol, and I'm sure you can guess how that went. Rosie had always been jealous of Carol. She saw her beauty as a threat, especially given her own insecurities about her weight loss. Even now, after all the progress she'd made, Rosie still felt inferior to Carol. "Hey, Rosie," Carol greeted her, a friendly smile on her face. "It's weird seeing you without your husband." "I'm not without him," Rosie replied, a bit defensive. "He's just at work." "Why do you ask?" Carol was quick to reassure her. "Oh, no reason. You're just lucky to have someone who loves you so much." Most guys are only interested in their own pleasure and drift away. If only someone looked at me the way your husband looks at you, Carol said. But Rosie cut her off, uninterested. It doesn't matter, Rosie said dismissively. Later, Rosie, knowing I'd be at work all day, decided to visit a bar she'd gone to the night before, thinking she could have a drink and still be home before I returned. When she walked in, she was greeted with a hug. "Oh my God, Rosie, it's been forever," exclaimed Evelyn Attery, an old college friend. "You look amazing. What's been going on? You've lost so much weight. I barely recognized you," she said. "How's your husband?" she asked casually. "He's good," Rosie replied, not bothering to elaborate. "Just hanging out, having fun." Soon, a group of men joined them at their table, and Rosie got up to dance with one of them. She was so caught up in the moment that she didn't even notice Carol walking in. But everyone else in the bar did. Carol watched Rosie, taking in her actions and the people she was with, before ordering a sandwich and leaving. When she went back to work, it seemed she had a new idea. In the meantime, I kept working long hours, planning Rosie's surprise birthday party. I invited her mother, her sister, and a few of our friends, bought gifts, and hoped this would help bring us closer. To my surprise, her mother, who had been distant for so long, offered to help decorate for the party. During Rosie's time in the hospital, we had grown a bit closer. She may not have cared for me romantically, but she respected how much I loved her daughter and accepted me in her own way. Over the next few days, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Rosie continued to leave for extended periods, coming home late. I couldn't remember the last time we had been intimate. At work, I could feel the weight of my unspoken frustration. The women there, sensing my need for relief, persistently tried to engage me in ways I didn't want. One evening, after returning home late from work, the phone rang. "Hey Elton, it's Carol," came the familiar voice. "Hi Carol. Any update on Rosie's test results?" I asked, already bracing myself for more bad news. "Not until tomorrow, but there's something important I need to talk to you about," Carol said urgently. "Could we meet somewhere? It won't take long." I suggested the park across from the hospital. It had been a spot where Carol and I had often met during Rosie's treatments. The park was filled with happy memories of shared dinners while Rosie was undergoing procedures, and I wanted to keep those moments untouched by whatever news Carol had. "I can be there in 20 minutes if that works," she said. "See you there?" I confirmed, feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. When I arrived, I found her sitting on one of the small benches we had often shared. I greeted her with a weak smile, trying to hide my unease. "Am I behind on payments? Is Rosie sick again?" I asked, bracing for more bad news. "Yes, she's unwell, but it's not cancer," Carol said, her tone serious. She went on to recount the places she had seen my wife recently, the people she had been with, and her behaviors. "I don't have hard evidence, but it looks like she might be cheating on you," Carol revealed quietly, her words cutting through the air like ice. I shook my head, disbelief flooding through me. "Carol, you're a great nurse, and I know you care, but Rosie would never do that. She loves me," I said, though my voice faltered, unsure if I was trying to convince her or myself. Carol's expression softened with sympathy, but she didn't back down. "I'm sorry, but you need to be careful," she said, her voice filled with concern. "I can't believe it," I responded, the weight of her words sinking in. "You're basing this on suspicions with no real proof. Maybe you should focus on your own life, Carol." I stood to leave, my frustration taking over. But then, to my surprise, Carol gently grabbed my hand. She touched my cheek, her fingers warm against my skin. For a moment, I froze, my anger dissolving into something else. "I hope I'm wrong, for your sake," Carol murmured, her voice low, almost as if she were speaking more to herself than to me. "It hurts to see you in so much pain, especially for someone who doesn't deserve it." Her touch lingered for just a moment longer, sending a shiver down my spine. "I'll be here for you if you need a friend," she added softly, slipping a small card into my hand before standing up and walking away. I stood there for a moment, staring at the card in my hand, watching her walk into the distance. Despite everything, I couldn't deny the surge of desire that hit me as I watched her go. It had been so long since Rosie and I had been a romantic moment, and yet now just seeing Carol move away from me had stirred something inside me. What Carol didn't know was that everything had already unraveled. She knew that if Elton found out the full truth too late, the heartbreak would be unbearable. It was better for him to experience the small, painful truths now than to face one overwhelming betrayal later. Although she had never wanted to hurt him, she could see that he needed to know about his wife's unfaithfulness. She couldn't pinpoint exactly when her feelings for Elton had shifted, but it didn't matter now. Maybe it had been witnessing his unwavering dedication to Rosie, his quiet sacrifices as he endured Rosie's dismissive behavior during her recovery. As Rosie began to treat him more like a servant than a loving husband, despite all he had done for her, Carol realized how much she had come to care for him. She had always been aware of her beauty, a fact others frequently pointed out. But no man had ever shown her the kind of love and tenderness that Elton showed Rosie. Carol realized she would give anything to be the recipient of such devotion. She was ready for the next phase of her plan. 2 nights later, I came home with a sense of anticipation, determined that the modest surprise party I had planned for Rosie would reignite the spark between us. I had been paying closer attention to her recent behavior, the growing distance, the late nights, and the increased drinking, and I knew something had changed. But I was holding out hope that tonight would be different. I had gone to bed early, but when I woke up, Rosie was beside me, smiling as she rolled over. Despite knowing she had likely been out partying, I brushed it off, reminding myself that she deserved to enjoy herself, celebrating the victory of surviving cancer. I had once dreamed of celebrating alongside her, but now, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. By 6:30 a.m., Rosie's mother, Phoebe, and her sister Eliana had arrived, eager to begin decorating. The party was meant to be private, just a few close friends, but the clock was ticking and Rosie was still not home. By 9 p.m., the guests were beginning to wonder where she was, and one by one, they started to leave, leaving their gifts behind. By 11 p.m., only Phoebe, Eliana, and I remained. I made one last attempt to reach Rosie. When she called back half an hour later, her voice was slurred. "Hey, love, I'm on my way home soon," she said, her words dragging together. "Where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Mom suggested we have a drink, and I just ended up staying with her and Eliana instead of coming home," she explained, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "We lost track of time. I ended up with them because they don't like you, and I didn't want their negativity to ruin your surprise," she added, her words distant and unconvincing. In the background, I could hear a man's voice urging her to stay longer. "We'll be together soon, and you can share your surprise then," she said, as though it was a casual promise. "Is it a big surprise?" she asked, her tone light, almost playful. "Somewhat," I said softly, the hollow feeling in my chest expanding. A heavy silence followed. Phoebe, sitting across from me, noticed my struggle to hold back tears. The weight of everything, of Rosie's lies, of my own shattered heart, was too much to bear. It felt as though my world had collapsed, and I didn't know how to react. "That's not accurate," Phoebe began, her voice hesitant. "I may have had doubts about you at first, but now I see things differently." "What nerve!" Eliana muttered under her breath. "Thank you both for coming," I said, trying to regain some composure. "I'll clean up and put Rosie's gifts away." "She'll be home soon?" Phoebe asked quietly. "I'm not sure," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But you're welcome to stay. I'm not sure watching her arrival will help either of us." "Why not?" Eliana challenged. "I'd love to see her reaction when she's confronted with her lies." "She fought cancer," I said softly, my voice cracking. "We don't know the full impact of it. All we can do now is support her and hope for the best." Phoebe and Eliana exchanged glances but didn't say anything more. After a moment, they both left, shaking their heads as they went. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't fix. I gathered my things, packing quickly. I wanted to minimize the number of trips I had to make. I left a note for Rosie on the kitchen table, the words simple and cold. I needed to get away, even if only for a while. The next day, during work breaks, I started searching for a divorce lawyer. I didn't make any calls yet, but the idea had taken root. My colleagues thought I was ill, maybe with a cold or the flu, because I kept to myself, staying distant. Rosie called me several times, but I didn't respond. I repeated the same routine for the next 3 days. Work, motel, sleep, repeat. On the third day, as I left the office, I was surprised to find Carol sitting on the hood of my car, her eyes full of emotion, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't you call me?" she demanded, frustration and concern in her voice. Here's the next section of the story with some rewording and restructuring for clarity and flow. I stayed silent, locking eyes with Carol, and in that moment, the emotional walls I had so carefully built up crumbled. Tears streamed down my face, the weight of everything overwhelming me. "Everything you warned me about was true," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Without saying another word, Carol jumped off the car and pulled me into a tight embrace. Despite the raw pain and confusion coursing through me, I couldn't ignore the inappropriate surge of desire that flickered in me as her chest pressed against mine. It felt wrong, but at the same time comforting in a way I couldn't explain. "I never wanted to cause you pain," Carol murmured into my ear, her voice trembling. "Please forgive me." Meanwhile, across town, Rosie was slowly coming to consciousness in her apartment, her head pounding with the aftermath of the previous night. She squinted at the light streaming through the windows, disoriented. "What day is it?" she groaned, her voice thick with the remnants of alcohol. She glanced around at the mess, the clutter of an evening she couldn't quite remember. "Elton needs to clean this up when he gets back. Why isn't he home yet? Who's knocking?" She winced as she stood up, her body aching from the previous night's revelry. Limply, she made her way to the door and peered through the peephole. "Phew, it's just Mom," she muttered, relieved. She quickly threw on a robe and opened the door. "Sorry for the mess, Mom," she apologized, trying to appear casual. "Elton seems to disappear into thin air when he's at work," she added with a forced laugh. Phoebe, standing in the doorway, didn't smile. Her eyes scanned Rosie's disheveled appearance, and there was no mistaking the disapproval in her tone. "Rosie, where were you? What were you doing last night?" Phoebe asked, her voice sharp, accusing. "From the way you look, I'm guessing I already know. Who were you with?" "What are you talking about, Mom?" Rosie snapped, her defensiveness rising. Phoebe wasn't buying it. "Rosie, why do you have hickeys on your neck?" she pressed, her eyes narrowing. Rosie froze, her heart racing. "Oh no," she muttered under her breath. "Elton better not see this." "Mom," she said, feigning nonchalance. "Could you make me some coffee? My head is killing me." Phoebe, reluctant but knowing her daughter needed something to calm her down, made her way to the kitchen. Rosie leaned against the door frame, silently cursing her own stupidity. "So," Phoebe began, her voice laced with quiet anger as she brewed the coffee. "How did you cover up your little lie that night?" "What lie, Mom?" Rosie asked, feigning confusion. Phoebe's eyes were steely. "The one you told your husband on your birthday," she clarified. "When you said you were with me and Eliana, when in fact we were at home, not even near you. You lied to him." Rosie's heart thudded. Her mind scrambled for an excuse, but it wasn't easy to find one. I need to think of something before he comes back," she muttered, panic creeping in. "You have to help me, Mom," Rosie said desperately. "Please." Phoebe folded her arms, standing firm. "Why should I help you, Rosie? You're the one who made this mess." Rosie dropped her head, defeated. "I know I've messed up," she admitted, her voice small. "But it was just for fun. I wanted to experience the things I missed out on when I was younger." Phoebe turned to face her. "What exactly are you saying?" Rosie sighed deeply, her voice filled with regret. "Back then, I was overweight, the chubby friend that no one wanted. No one ever looked at me like I was beautiful. But when I met Elton, everything changed. He made me feel beautiful. He saw me. He made me confident. I started dressing better, feeling better because of him. She paused, chewing on her lip before continuing. But now that I've lost the weight, it's like the world's opened up. More men are paying attention and it feels thrilling. Flirting with them, teasing them and dropping them when I'm done. I've never had options like this before. It's not serious. I'd never leave Elton. I love him. I'm just having fun. It's not a big deal. She met Phoebe's eyes. But you always said he was average and dull, Mom. And besides, Elton will never find out. He's always at work. He's so busy he doesn't even notice. Maybe he should join the game or risk losing me. Phoebe didn't respond immediately, but her gaze softened a little. That's probably true, she murmured, though there was no real conviction in her voice. She handed Rosie a note she had found on the kitchen counter. Dear Rosie, I'm glad to see you enjoying yourself after everything you've been through. You deserve it. Beating cancer is no small feat, and you've faced it head-on and come out victorious. You're stronger and more radiant than ever. From the beginning, I saw how special you were, and I fell deeply in love with you. Now you have the confidence to show the world how amazing you are, and how big your heart is. You deserve that, too. I've realized that there's no place for me in your life anymore. You've won my heart long ago, and I want you to keep moving forward. I hope you read this letter tonight so we can discuss what's next for us. If there's a future at all. If I don't hear from you, I'll assume the worst and proceed with filing for divorce, so you can have the freedom you deserve. You can keep the apartment. I can't come back, there are just too many memories. I hope your next partner appreciates you more than I did. I gave it my all, but it wasn't enough. You deserve better. I'll always love you. Elton. Rosie's eyes widened in shock as she read the letter, and the full weight of Elton's words hit her like a tidal wave. She collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Phoebe watched her daughter with a mixture of disappointment and regret, thinking to herself, what a foolish girl I've raised. Meanwhile, across town, Carol was guiding Elton to her home, her arm wrapped around his waist for support. She circled the car and helped him out gently, then led him inside and settled him on the couch. He was a shell of the man he used to be. Gone were the moments of strength, the quiet resolve. He seemed lost, exhausted, his body and mind worn thin from the emotional strain. Carol could see it clearly now. Elton had been on autopilot for days, just going through the motions. Now he had hit rock bottom. But she knew better than anyone that there was more to him than he realized. I'm going to help him break free from this deceitful woman, Carol thought to herself. Her resolve was firm. She knew now wasn't the time to confront Elton with all the details about Rosie. She had hired a detective agency to follow Rosie's every move for the past week, and what they'd uncovered was far worse than Elton could possibly know. But she also knew he wasn't ready to hear it yet. Rosie had done more than lie about a few nights out. She'd crossed lines Elton hadn't even suspected. Carol wasn't sure if he could handle the truth in his current state. So for now, she kept quiet. After settling Elton on the couch, Carol changed into more comfortable clothes and began preparing dinner. Steak and salad. As they ate, the silence between them was heavy. Elton pushed his food around his plate, lost in thought. Neither of them spoke during dinner. Afterward, Carol turned off Elton's cell phone. There were no messages, a sign that Rosie was still too drunk to notice his absence. Carol called the hospital to let them know she would be absent for personal reasons, and encouraged Elton to do the same. I know you have financial obligations, but take the time, Carol insisted gently. He hesitated but eventually agreed to take 2 days off. Carol gave him a blanket and tucked him in on the couch, her embrace tender as she kissed his forehead. If you need me, I'm here, she whispered, pointing to her bedroom upstairs. Meanwhile, Rosie was frantically trying to reach Elton. She called his cell phone repeatedly, frustrated when it went to voicemail each time. She couldn't understand why he wasn't responding. She needed to explain herself. She didn't want a divorce. She couldn't live without him. Elton had always been her pillar, her unwavering support, and the thought of losing him now was unbearable. She kept thinking about all they had been through, the way they had fought cancer together, how he had shaved his head in solidarity with her. She recalled how he had been there for her through every trial, every moment of self-doubt, and she realized just how much she had taken him for granted. She had always seen him as her rock, but now, she realized her recent actions were pushing him away. She wasn't the woman he had married anymore. She felt foolish, regretting the way things had spiraled out of control. Finally, she tried calling his workplace. To her surprise, she learned that Elton had taken a few days off and was no longer in his office. He had been reassigned after his recent promotion. Rosie felt a deep pang of guilt as the realization hit her. Elton was no longer her constant. He was pulling away, and now she was left trying to figure out how to fix the mess she had made. She realized that her initial approach, thinking she could talk him into coming home, was naive. She had always believed she could solve things with a few words, a kiss, and an apology. But now, she was facing the reality that things had gone too far. Rosie's guilt only deepened as she thought back on the past few hours. She hadn't meant to lose control. She just wanted to have a little fun. But now, it seemed she might lose the most important thing in her life, Elton. The allure of unfamiliar men had offered Rosie an illusion of control, a way to reclaim something she felt she had lost. But in the end, it came at the expense of the one thing she should have reserved for Elton. There was no love involved, just empty, drunken encounters, she reflected bitterly. Now the harsh truth had set in. She had to face the extent of Elton's knowledge, knowing that she couldn't undo the damage she had caused. Even as she tried to justify her actions, a deep sense of shame gnawed at her. She doubted she could ever forgive herself. She had become everything she once despised. Meanwhile, Carol remained a steady presence in Elton's life, helping him slowly regain his footing. Together, they collected his belongings from the hotel and bought the necessities he needed. At Carol's insistence, they moved his things into her guest room, a temporary refuge. She encouraged him to talk, gently coaxing out his words. It wasn't easy at first. Elton was quiet, weighed down by the turmoil of his life, but eventually, the conversation deepened. They avoided mentioning Rosie altogether, as if acknowledging her presence would only make the pain worse. The 2-day break eventually came to an end, and it was time to return to work. Carol handed Elton his cell phone. Silently, she watched him scroll through the hundreds of missed calls, each one from Rosie. Elton didn't flinch as he deleted them all, his expression hardening. He didn't need to hear her voice right now. With every press of the button, he was letting go of the woman he had once loved. His jaw set with a quiet resolve, and in that moment, Carol believed he was going to be all right. At the office, Elton felt slightly better, though the weight of everything still lingered. Some co-workers had noticed Carol picking him up recently, and gossip quickly spread. "Who's the redhead in the Mustang?" Dave asked, his tone light but curious. "Elton's got a supermodel driving him around," another colleague joked with a grin. Elton managed a tight smile but didn't respond. Carol's beauty was undeniable. Anyone could see that. But did he genuinely believe the jokes? Or was he just playing along to avoid further questions? His cheerful facade began to crack when someone teased him about being involved with the mysterious redhead. It was all light-hearted at first, but Elton couldn't shake the feeling that they were completely oblivious to the deeper betrayal he had just experienced at home. Everything seemed to be under control until the end of the workday. As Elton was finishing up some paperwork, a security guard rushed into his office, urgently summoning him to the parking lot. He feared for his car but was unprepared for what awaited him. Before he even reached the lot, he heard the sound of raised voices. "What the hell are you doing on my husband's car, you homewrecker?" Rosie's voice rang out, sharp with fury. "You abandoned him with your partying." Carol shot back, her words like daggers. "What are you even talking about?" Rosie snapped, taking a step toward Carol. "You vanished into bars and betrayed him." Carol spat, standing her ground. The tension between them escalated quickly, and before the confrontation could go any further, the security guards stepped in to separate the two women. A small crowd had gathered by now, watching the scene unfold. Elton moved swiftly through the gathering, guiding Carol toward the Mustang. He spoke quietly, his voice low but firm. "Go home, Carol. I'll follow shortly." Carol looked at him with concern but didn't argue. She trusted him to handle it. He instructed the guards to detain Rosie for at least 10 minutes before driving off to follow Carol. As Elton walked away, he heard Rosie's anguished cries echoing through the parking lot. Despite the growing feelings he had for Carol, anger and pain surged within him. He wasn't sure if he was angry at Rosie or at himself. "Elton, we need to talk." Rosie's voice echoed after him, desperation laced with the sound of tears. "We can work this out. You still care about me. I know you do." A part of him wanted to believe her, to let her convince him that things could go back to normal. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple anymore. He wasn't the man he used to be, and neither was she. As Elton turned away, tears welled up in his eyes. The overwhelming weight of the situation threatened to crush him, but he walked away anyway. Later that evening, when Elton arrived at Carol's house, he was ready to confront everything he had been avoiding. He felt a strange mixture of clarity and confusion, unsure of what came next. "What's your plan, Elton?" Carol asked gently, her voice full of understanding. "I need clarity about my marriage," Elton replied, his voice steady but uncertain. Carol studied him for a moment. "Are you sure you want to know?" "Absolutely," Elton affirmed, determined to face whatever truths were left. Carol hesitated for a moment, before getting up and retrieving a large envelope from her office. She placed it carefully on the table between them. "Everything you need is in here," she said, her voice soft but serious. "But I urge you not to open it." Elton's gaze flicked to the envelope. "What's inside?" "When I first told you about her, you said I lacked proof," Carol began, her tone quiet. "You were right. Despite everything I saw, I struggled to believe it, just like when it happened to me." She paused, her face a mixture of empathy and caution. "I anticipated that you would need evidence, so I hired a private investigator. My cousin owed me a favor, so it didn't cost anything. The file contains photos, audio recordings, receipts, everything. But trust me, if there's any love left for her in your heart, you're better off not seeing this." Elton was silent, his eyes fixed on the envelope. Carol continued, "You know she's betrayed you. Seeing the details will only cause you more pain. You don't need that right now. Once you see it, it will haunt you. You're starting to see reason. This file will only drag you back into the past. But do what you must." Elton's hand hovered over the envelope, his fingers trembling. But despite Carol's warning, he reached for it. The first photo he pulled out was devastating. It showed Rosie, lying on a table in a bar, surrounded by men. Elton's breath caught in his throat, and he felt as though the room was spinning. The pain of seeing the image in front of him made it impossible to breathe. He returned the photo to the envelope, but his hands shook as he tossed it across the room. Carol was there immediately, sitting beside him and pulling him into her embrace. He buried his face in her shoulder, his tears mixing with the weight of everything he had just seen. They sat together in silence for the rest of the night. The next morning, they visited a divorce attorney that Carol had recommended. "I'll make this as painless as possible," Naomi, the attorney, assured them as they sat in her office. "You have no children and few assets aside from medical bills." "I'll cover those," Elton volunteered, his voice steady but hollow. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Elton shrugged. "Given the debt and her behavior, it's the least I can do." Naomi nodded. "This should be straightforward. If she contests, we'll threaten to expose the evidence." She handed Elton the paperwork. "The divorce papers will be ready in a few days." In the following days, things deteriorated quickly. Rosie received the divorce papers and immediately tore them apart. She refused to sign them, insisting that she would never agree to a divorce and refusing to seek legal counsel. She wanted a legal separation instead and demanded marriage counseling. "I won't sign these papers," she said, her voice trembling with defiance. "I want Elton back. I'll do whatever it takes to save our relationship. Please, come home." Naomi had warned Elton that Rosie might contest everything, but Rosie remained adamant. I'll stop at nothing. If you need to fly to Rome and tell the Pope I'm unfaithful, I'll buy your ticket. But no one, especially that redhead, will take my husband from me." Her threats were empty, but they were enough to keep Elton's mind spinning. 2 days later, he found himself sitting across from Rosie in Naomi's office. "Why are you doing this to us?" Rosie asked, her voice shaking, tears filling her eyes. "You brought this upon us, Rosie," Elton replied calmly. His voice was steady, but his heart was heavy. "I may have gone too far, drank too much, and neglected you, but that doesn't justify betraying me like this." Rosie looked at him with a mix of anger and desperation. "I understand why you're upset, but that doesn't mean we should throw away everything we've built. I love you, Elton. Please believe me." "I don't believe you anymore," Elton countered, his voice low but firm. "You lied to me, betrayed my trust, and broke my heart. You did things I never thought you were capable of. You didn't care about my feelings. It was all about you." "But Elton, I fought cancer," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "You don't understand what it's like. After everything I've been through, I just wanted to live. I wanted to experience life. Going through something like that changes you. You should understand that." "I do," Elton said quietly. "But you're wrong. You had a choice, and now you'll have all the time in the world to explore. But I won't be in your way anymore. You can do whatever you want. You can be with whoever you want. I'm done." With those final words, Elton stood up and walked away, leaving Rosie behind, her sobs echoing in the empty office. "Elton, you can't just leave me. What do you mean I'm wrong?" Rosie cried out, her voice raw with desperation. Elton stopped in his tracks and turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "Rosie, you didn't fight cancer alone," he said quietly, his voice tight. "We fought it together." "What?" Rosie started, confused by the sudden shift in Elton's tone. But before she could finish, he cut her off. "I was there every single day in the hospital," Elton continued, his voice breaking slightly. "You had medicine to dull the pain, but I had to watch the person I loved most suffer, powerless to help. I had to be strong for you to keep your spirits up, but inside, I was falling apart. Every night, after they made me leave, I went home and cried. I was terrified of losing you. And then every morning, I put on a brave face and did it all over again." His voice trembled with emotion as he added, "When it was over, I wanted to live too. I wanted to enjoy life. But the person I wanted to enjoy it with was busy drinking and cheating. One of us had to work to pay for all those medical bills, and that was me. You have a new body and a new outlook, but I have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and a broken heart." He took a deep breath, gathering his strength. "You found new priorities, and I found out my wife was a cheater. You say you love me, but how do you think I'll feel when I hear about all the men you were with? Where were they when you were in the hospital? Cancer may not have killed you, but it killed our marriage." Elton's words hung in the air for a long moment before he spoke again, quieter this time. "Maybe it wasn't the cancer that ended us. Maybe it was just you." He looked at her one final time, the weight of his words settling between them. "Sign the papers, Rosie. I have nothing more to say to you." With that, Elton turned and walked out of the office, leaving Rosie sitting there, her face crumpled in disbelief, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was alone now, with nothing but the echo of his final words. Outside, Carol saw the distress on Elton's face the moment he stepped through the door. She didn't need him to say a word to understand the depth of what he had just gone through. Without a word, she handed him the keys to her Mustang SVT Cobra, a car Elton had always admired. "Let's go home," she said softly, her voice a quiet comfort. Elton looked at her, his heart heavy with grief but grateful for her steady presence. "Can we take a drive first?" he asked, his voice strained. "No," Carol replied gently, placing a hand on his arm. "We have plenty of time for that. Right now, you need to rest, and you need to eat something." She drove them back to her house, the familiar rumble of the Mustang's engine a small comfort to Elton as he looked out the window, lost in thought. When they arrived, Carol dropped her coat onto the living room floor, her movements playful and teasing. She glanced back at him over her shoulder, a smile tugging at her lips. As she climbed the stairs, she unbuttoned her blouse, letting it fall to the floor in a trail behind her, and kicked off her shoes, leaving a path of discarded clothing. By the time she reached the top of the stairs, she had also shed her tights, dangling them provocatively before disappearing into her bedroom. Elton watched, feeling a surge of desire mixed with confusion, his emotions still raw from the emotional whirlwind he'd just experienced. Carol's movements were confident, sensual. She was taking control, as she had always done in their time together. Elton followed her upstairs, picking up the clothes she had discarded along the way, a subtle understanding passing between them. When he reached the landing, Carol was waiting. The sight of her was enough to make Elton's breath catch in his throat. His thoughts, still clouded by the events of the day, scattered as he took in the sight of her. "Come get me," she whispered, her voice low and seductive, as she darted down the hallway toward her bedroom. Elton understood then, the powerful pull between them, the way her presence was like a balm to his wounded soul. He felt alive again, despite everything that had happened. And in that moment, he realized the truth of George Clinton's lyrics in Atomic Dog. Why must I feel like that? Why must I chase the cat? The confusion, the need for release, it all made sense now. He chased her to the bedroom, where she was already waiting. She slowly undressed him, each piece of clothing discarded with deliberate care, as if savoring the anticipation of what was to come. Each moment, each touch, grew more intense, more urgent, as though they were trying to outrun the pain of the past. "Carol, Elton began, but she silenced him, her finger pressed gently to his lips. She was different from Rosie, fierce, passionate, and completely present. She wasn't soft or submissive. She took control in a way that was both empowering and liberating. In her, Elton found something that was completely his, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. She made it clear she was devoted to him, body and soul. She wasn't just a distraction from his pain. She was a promise of something better, something real. They explored every part of each other, physically and emotionally, as the connection between them deepened. With every touch, Carol shifted Elton's focus from the hurt of his past with Rosie to the possibility of a future with her. Carol's past had been scarred by betrayal too. Her ex-husband's cruel words echoed in her mind. No matter how beautiful a woman is, she becomes old news after a while, and you need something new. But in Elton, she saw someone who would cherish her, someone who didn't take her for granted. Weeks passed, and as expected, Rosie refused to sign the divorce papers. She plotted to catch Elton with Carol, hoping to sabotage their relationship and win him back. She thought that by seeing them together, she could shake him, make him doubt his decision, and perhaps rekindle the bond they once had. But as much as she tried, it was becoming increasingly clear that Elton was no longer hers. One afternoon, Rosie saw them together at a restaurant. She watched them through the window, her eyes filled with a mix of rage and sadness, as Carol tenderly caressed Elton's cheek. He reciprocated by holding her hand, kissing it softly. In that moment, everything Rosie had hoped for fell apart. Elton hadn't followed the path she had expected. He hadn't gone out and slept with other women to get back at her. Instead, he had found someone who truly cared for him, someone who was giving him the love and attention she had never been able to provide. Realizing what she had lost, Rosie's mind unraveled. In a fit of desperation, she burst into the restaurant, hurling insults at Carol. "Stay away from my husband," she screamed. Carol, calm and composed, met her accusations with a simple, unflinching reply. "You're the one who let him slip away," she said, her tone cold but not unkind. Rosie's face twisted with pain. "No, I didn't mean to. I was just seeking amusement. I never wanted him to leave me. You won't win him back." Carol's response was quiet, but firm. "He would already be mine if you would just sign those papers." Rosie's anger flared again. "Not in a million years," she shouted. "I'll stop you first." The scene grew tense, and as onlookers stared, Rosie's anger gave way to something far worse. Her complexion paled, and she staggered, struggling to stay upright. It didn't take long before she collapsed to the floor, clutching her chest as though she couldn't breathe. "I don't feel well," she murmured weakly before gathering herself and stumbling out of the restaurant, leaving a crowd of concerned bystanders in her wake. 3 months later, Elton and Carol were married. Rosie's cancer, which had been in remission, returned aggressively. She was readmitted to the hospital, but this time the battle was different. Despite receiving excellent care, the absence of someone to share the burden with, someone who truly loved her, made the struggle unbearable. She spent her days asking about Elton, writing letters to him, begging for forgiveness or just asking for a visit. Elton, seeing the depth of her suffering, offered to see her if she would sign the divorce papers, but Rosie's pride wouldn't allow it. As her health deteriorated rapidly, she became a shell of the woman she once was. A month later, Rosie passed away. At her funeral, Elton delivered a heartfelt eulogy, focusing on the good memories of their relationship, even though they had been separated. He chose to remember the love they had shared, not the heartbreak. In a touching gesture, Elton revealed that he and Carol had decided to name their unborn child after Rosie. It was his way of acknowledging the past while looking forward.